I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. I'm your host, Jesse Lawler, excited to bring you the 51st episode in this podcast dedicated to the improvement of your own brain by any and all means at your disposal. And this week, means that might be most easily accomplished while at the beach or seashore. I'm going to be speaking this week with Dr. Michael Crawford of the Imperial College London, who's an evolutionary biologist, nutrition expert, many times author, and a man who's been instrumental in changing the way that we view the evolution of the human animal. Dr. Crawford first came to my attention on an earlier episode that we did about fish oil some months ago, and ever since then I've been trying to track him down to get him on the podcast, and we finally succeeded, and really just a great interview. I was super happy with the conversation that you're about to listen to. This is a longer episode than some of the last few, which I really credit to the fact that he just kept saying interesting stuff, and I couldn't bring myself to either cut him off while we were talking or cut too much out of the episode during the editing. So brace yourself for a lot of interesting stuff. If you hang around until the end of the episode, I'm going to tell you about a very weird study. So sometimes people ask, when they hear about smart drugs, is that really real? Can a pill really make you think differently? And I say, well, yeah, of course. I mean, pills can make all kinds of different things happen, right? And, sort of go and justify my excitement about nootropics. But now I've got a new little arrow in my quiver. I'm going to say, not only can a pill make you think differently, but a steering wheel in your car can make you more likely to lie. People are going to say, what? I'm going to say, no, it's science. And you're going to find out what I'm talking about in the ruthless listener retention gimmick. But before we get into any of that, let's do This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
Okay, so instead of calling this a This Week in Neuroscience, I actually should probably be calling this a Next Spring in Neuroscience. But this is an article that I came across in the New York Times just recently. It's sort of a profile piece on a professor at Harvard named Ellen Langer. She's 67 years old. She's the longest serving professor of psychology at Harvard. And she's been studying for decades now the psychology of age. Long story short, the first major study she did that directly relates to this article was in 1981. She had 8 men in their 70s go to a converted monastery in New Hampshire where everything was set up to seem like it was 1959. They had posters on the walls from 1959, books on the shelves, television from 1959, black and white. They didn't have mirrors for the participants in this experiment to see what they currently looked like, and they were told to behave as if they were back in 1959 at the age they were at the time. Everybody treated them that way. Everything in their experience was back to the future-ish to 1959. And then the gerontologists would study the physical biomarkers of age and how things changed over this time, that they were in this sort of weird time warp environment, which was not a terribly long time. It was only a 5-day study. But the results were almost too good. The participants were suppler. They showed greater manual dexterity. They sat taller. All these things as if they were sloughing off years from the way that they looked, felt, behaved, etc. Now, there was a lot of confounding factors that made this maybe not a perfectly designed study, and something like this would be tough to test. Are the old people behaving a certain way because they're trying to please the people putting on the experiment for them, and things like that. So while some people found the results very promising, other people were unpersuaded. But this is the sort of work that Dr. Langer has been doing for the past several decades. And there have been many sort of studies similar in nature to the one I just discussed over the course of the past couple of decades, and many of them have shown very promising twinges of evidence, but again, not necessarily things that people are considering to be nail-in-the-coffin evidence that age is all in our head or age is largely in our head, things like that. But Dr. Langer, who from the article seems to be an eternal optimist, is going to be doing a new study next spring in Mexico. She's got a location where she's going to be bringing people with late-stage cancer to and seeing if a similar roll-back-the-clock sort of psychological environment can have measurable, quantifiable effects on the tumor size of these people with late-stage cancer. So she's basically sort of swinging for the the fences with the idea that whether these sorts of changes are placebo effects or not, at a certain point, it doesn't really matter if something is a placebo effect if it's having hyper-measurable physiological results, and what could be more important than something like reduction of tumor size in a cancer patient. So the results are not in this. This experiment has not been done yet, but really interesting article in New York Times, worth giving a read to, and exciting that this is going to be taking place in spring 2015. So we'll get to know how this all plays out.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So a couple thank yous going out. First of all, I would like to thank Citizen 55555, who left a review of Smart Drug Smarts with appropriately 5 stars on iTunes, who said, as somewhat of a podcast power user and amateur biohacker, I must say Smart Drug Smarts has been on my top 5 podcast list since I found it several months ago. Thank you. That is awesome. I, too, have a top 5 podcast list, which I love them all dearly. And there are so many good podcasts out there now. It's kind of getting a little bit ridiculous. But I would like to give a little hat tip to 2 other podcasters out there. One is Roderick Russell of Remarkably Human Radio and Michael Osterlink of The Michael Osterlink Show, both of whom were kind enough to invite me on as an actual interview guest on their podcasts in the past couple of weeks. Not surprisingly, we were kicking around the can on smart drugs, nootropics, biohacking, health, and things like that. And I really appreciate getting a chance to get on and bring what we're doing to their audiences. I'll try to give a quick little elevator pitch on both shows. Remarkably Human Radio is a relatively new podcast, just started in the past couple of months. It's still very young, but he's just been hitting it out of the park with really interesting interviews on a wide variety of topics, all of which I guess I would characterize as, if not necessarily being about self-improvement, at least are talking with people that are so inspiring that it kind of makes you want to be a better person, because the guests and the topics and the can-do mindsets of the people that he's talking with are so inspiring. Michael Osterlink's show is a bit longer in the tooth. He's been around for quite a while now. He's got a ton of interviews, ranging from health and fitness and mindset, personal optimization. He's from a special ops military background, which is as can-do gets. And I think also has a lot of political current events, realpolitik kind of guests and topics that he covers as well. So definitely both of those worth checking out.
Smart Drug Smarts.
Now we'll get back to the normal order of things and have me doing the interview. I'm going to be interviewing Dr. Michael A. Crawford of the Imperial College London. He's the director of the Institute of Brain Chemistry and Human Nutrition. He's a founder trustee of the Mother and Child Foundation, president of the McCarrison Society, author of the 1989 book, The Driving Force, Food, Evolution, and the Future, a book which talks about the availability of food supplies being probably an underrepresented, underappreciated factor in the direction that evolution runs in. And he's developed those ideas and how they apply to the evolution of Homo sapiens, and is, as you will hear, a very, very vocal proponent of seafood in the human diet. We're going to be talking a lot about that. So I was about to say, let's dive in, which I normally do say, but then I just realized that would be an absolutely atrocious pun. So let's just start the interview. Having read about your work, the overall thesis of your career seems to be that nutrition and the access to nutrition has shaped and is still shaping the development of life on Earth, and that we ignore that fact at our peril.
Yes, that's perfectly correct. So that is the way we look at it. What goes up can come down, and usually does. And the point is, you can't understand, in science at any rate, the emergence of the big brain that we have as Homo sapiens and our intelligence just simply by magic. It had to be motivated by chemistry, to put it bluntly, because the brain is a bunch of chemicals, and very specific chemicals are required for its work and function. And a lot of the ones that are most specific for the signaling systems, for example, that enable thought processes, sensory systems, vision, hearing, and all the rest of it, touch, are dependent on things that you have to eat. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out that if you don't get those things, it's going to go backwards.
So to put that into context, is being a landlubber bad for your brain?
Well, to put it in the framework of where did it all come from, it's very easy, because everybody knows this, that the brain evolved in the sea 500 billion years ago. They may not know it was 500 billion years ago, but we know we evolved in the marine environment, and we've got the chemistry to show the link with the living systems that would have lived around about 500 to 600 million years ago. And that chemistry is the same in the cephalopods, in the fish, in the amphibia, in the reptiles, in the birds, in the mammals and ourselves, all the way down from the beginning. It's the same chemistry that is used to build the signaling systems of the brain, and that is chemicals that come from the sea. And today, of course, as before, they come from the marine food web, and they're really in very poor supply on the land food web. And what has happened of late is that we have, in the last century, particularly, been enhancing to great effect the productivity of land-based food products through intensification and so on. And so there's been a shift from the balance between what we got from the sea and what we got from the land into effectively towards the land-based stuff. Now, if you look at all the land-based mammals, what you see is that as they get bigger and bigger bodies, so their brains shrink. You know, you start off with little capuchin monkey with about 2.5% brain-to-body weight ratio. You end up with a rhinoceros about 0.001, or even a chimpanzee at about 0.1. So Homo sapiens has got 2%. So how did we get that? And without exception, all land-based mammals have lost their brains. And the only comparable brain size that we have on the planet is in the marine environment, with the things like the dolphin. It's 1.8 kilograms of brain. So it's all pretty obvious if you look there.
Wow, that's amazing. 1.8 kilograms of brain in a dolphin. And what's the average weight in a human?
Well, the average weight of a human brain is about 1.3, 1.4 kilograms.
So we're outweighed by dolphins.
We're outweighed by dolphins, yes. But don't forget, the dolphin has to shut half of its brain down when it goes to sleep. Otherwise, it'll drown. And its brain is used for much more sensory stuff than ours is. They have sonalocation, for example. And there's a huge area in the human brain devoted to two things. The hand, one, and the second thing is, not in any order of priority, is of course the way that the signals are handled from the visual system. Now the dolphin, well, it doesn't have hands. It has got this huge other area of brain that has to serve the sonalocation. It's also got vision. So it really has completely different challenges. And in terms of navigation, we navigate on 2 dimensions, and the dolphin navigates in 3 dimensions. So it's got a bigger challenge with it, more to do with this big brain.
So going back to humans for a bit, I guess in the development of humans, obviously we started seeing this massive growth in brain size versus what our monkey forebears had around 2 million years ago. What was going on at that point that sort of spurred that growth?
My personal view is that if you look at the genetics, the geneticists tell us that we separated from the great apes around about 5 to 7 million years ago. Now, the interesting thing is there was a migration from land to sea. The land-based mammals, for some bizarre reason, got fed up with wandering about in the land and started mucking about in the sea. And this started about 40 to 50 million years ago. Now, these all became, from land-based mammals, the marine mammals. Now, that ended about 7 million years ago. I think the dolphin was the last to sort of turn up as fully committed to the sea. So that, in my guess, is that is when it's the time that, coincident with the geneticists saying we separate from the great apes, that a sort of small primate wandered down a river, came to an estuary, and saw the seabirds picking away at all the oysters and crabs and catching fish and so on and so forth. And so they've said to each other, hey guys, we don't have to climb trees anymore. And so I would put it that we really started working both land and coastal resources at a very early stage, that they went through various bottlenecks, and people migrated inland and got lost and lost their brain. All sorts of things happened, and many species may have branched off from what was going on at the seaside. And the trouble is that of course, we don't have much fossil record of that, because as Curtis Marians points out, most of the stuff that would have pertained to that area is under the ocean anyway, because of rising sea levels. But they have got now very, very good, incontrovertible evidence of, in South Africa, through Curtis Marian's work and John Parkington's work, of people at exploiting the marine food web without question at the time that early humans evolved on the planet, or can be identified at any rate with the fossil record. There's no question about it. They've got absolutely chapter and verse. The use of ochre and all sorts of things showing decorations already about 160,000 years ago.
Are there any surviving alternative theories that are given any credence as to humans being able to get the brain up to the size that we have it now without ready access to the ocean?
There are, yeah. I mean, the bulk of paleoanthropologists think of humans sort of bumming around the savannas of Africa and killing buffaloes and things like that. That is the prevailing wisdom, is the savanna hypothesis. And they don't like the idea that humans actually had a coastal origin. And may I point out, the coastal origin would also involve the use of lakes and rivers as well as the sea, because we've written papers showing that they're pretty good in terms of providing what is needed for the brain. But I don't see the savanna hypothesis as having any real scientific credence. I mean, the credibility of the coastal hypothesis is both physiologically and in terms of the way in which, in fact, our physiology is much more like a marine mammal. And this was pointed out by Alistair Hardy in 1966 or something like that. So Alistair Hardy said, we've got temperature dependence by sweating. We have a layer of subcutaneous fat. We have driving reflexes and a whole bunch of stuff, which is much more like a marine mammal. The animals in the savannah don't waste water. There's not much water there. You see, what they do is they let the body temperatures rise. They don't sweat. They let the body temperatures rise, and it cools off at night. And we don't have that kind of physiology. And they have fur to keep out the heat as well. And so the whole sort of savanna hypothesis is based on some kind of, I think, male dominance, macho stuff, sort of running around with spears and arrows and things like that. We may have done that. I wouldn't say we didn't do it, but I think when you were running around with spears and arrows, you were already pretty smart. And I think that must have come much later during the evolution of intelligence.
Yeah, it's hard to think that hunting down a buffalo with a spear is any more macho than hunting down a large fish.
The beautiful thing about the marine habitat is that, of course, if you're heavily pregnant, you can't go running around the savannas for a start. But if you're heavily pregnant, all you'd have to do is just wander around the coastline and you've got all the food in the world that you need. It's difficult for us today to visualize just how wealthy the marine food web and the coastal resources would have been. There must have been some colossal attractiveness for, wave after wave of land-based mammals to grovel around the seashore and then become so fully committed that they can't get back on the land again. It's just unbelievable. There had to be a huge diversity of food, and we know that there was. There's some places still on the planet that are like what it might have been, but very few left because it's all been picked clean or polluted. So there you are.
That's really interesting to think about, because for the last probably 10,000 years or so, we've had the ability to go out in boats and fish offshore, essentially. Even if you hunted as much as you possibly could in the ocean, there would always be just offshore a whole wealth of new animals waiting to make contact again. It's like you would kind of have a continually replenished food supply on the edges between the land and the sea.
Well, that's right. And you see, the beautiful thing about this is that we know that the molecule, the docosahexaenoic acid, which is the top omega-3 fatty acid, that is used in the signaling systems in vision and the synapses of the brain. We know that molecule not only is used for building these things, it's also says its own story. It actually tells the genome what to do, how to build the brain itself. It's unbelievable. The work in Hungary has shown this quite very clearly. It triggers the expression of several hundred genes that are involved with brain growth and development and function. You've got everything there in science. You've got a woman, wandering around the coastline, picking up the mussels and oysters and a crab or something like that, or maybe fish from a rocky pool after the tide's gone out. And she's going to get a wealth of this stuff. So generation after generation, she's got this epigenetic power driving her her fetus to develop bigger and bigger brains. And so we can explain this absolutely fully in science, where there's no such explanation for coming from the savannah hypothesis.
You mentioned pregnant mother on the coastline, and obviously the development of the brain during gestation and early childhood is one of the most important things for brains past, present, and future. There are prohibitions in some places, or at least advisories, against pregnant women eating too much seafood for fear of mercury and things like that. Tell us your take.
That mercury business is a load of rubbish, if you don't mind me saying. The FDA put out this advisory several years ago. Captain Joseph Hibben from the National Institutes of Health published a paper in the Lancet, 2006, 2007, I can't remember which year it was, but one of those. And he showed that in the biggest longitudinal study that's ever been done, over 14,000 pregnancies, that when you looked at the 8-year-old children born from these 14,000 pregnancies, verbal reasoning power, social scores, behavioral scores, all clocked up in a direct line progressively with the amount of fish and seafood that the woman had eaten during pregnancy. And in fact, those women who had complied with the FDA advisory had the worst outcomes for their children at 8 years of age. There's more or less a straight line function going upwards with increase in fish and seafood during the pregnancy, 8 years later in the children. Now, this is the most powerful evidence that you can get from a very well-established group working at the National Institutes of Health and the Bristol University in England. Now, let's just think about another thing. This was published after the FDA advisory, and what Captain Hibben said in the paper said that the advisory was actually doing harm, because if you followed the advisory, your children would not do as well as the people who did not follow the advisory. So when you look at the population's behavior, take the Japanese, for example. The Japanese ladies eat fish and seafood at every meal in the evening, every day of the week, sometimes more than once a day they'll have fish or seafood. And they gave birth to the children that have grown up and today have the least major depression, the least coronary heart disease, the least Western cancer, and the greatest longevity. So where on earth is the evidence of neurotoxicity and damage that the FDA was talking about? I just don't think that they did the sums properly. And they are, thankfully, at last now revising that advisory. So let's hope they come up with a better solution to what they came up with a few years ago. And the problem with that is that, of course, the British Food Standards Agency and the European Food Standards Agency followed the American FDA like a bunch of sheep. And none of those three ever thought about what the Japanese data. Of course, it's not just the Japanese data, it's also data from China and from the Far East as well, where you see these, people who eat a lot of fish and seafood. There's not a scrap of evidence of any harm.
It's funny. I guess this just occurred to me as an American. It's not something I'd never thought about before, but both Japan and Britain are obviously island nations and have a lot of access to the ocean. How come do you think Japan is so much more renowned for its seafood eating than the British Isles?
I would like to suggest to you that the very beginnings of the Industrial Revolution and the great sort of stuff that happened a few centuries ago in Britain was very large in part because Britain was a seafaring and seafood-eating nation. We were pretty close to having quite a lot of seafood as well as land-based stuff at that time. I mean, in Queen Elizabeth's time, first Queen Elizabeth's time, 50% of her income came from the cod fisheries. So that was that's something to think about. Now, of course, in Britain, we've lost that. Japan still has it, but is losing it gradually with globalization. That is a serious tragedy because they're talking about the rise in mental ill health now, as in the United States, Britain, and Europe, the number one burden of ill health. It really is phenomenal. It's overtaken all other burdens of ill health. In the UK, the Department of Health has estimated that the cost in 2010 for mental ill health was 105 billion. and that's a cost greater than heart disease and cancer combined. So I think we're really going downhill now, and that's very serious.
So you published your book, The Driving Force, Food, Evolution, and the Future, 25 years ago this year. If you were to release an updated version today, would there be any major changes you would make?
There's two answers to that. One is that we're now revising it, and we'll hopefully publish a new edition, bringing it up to date with all these figures of mental ill health and what we call the global crisis in nutrition. And we'll hope to have it ready for publication early next year. But to give you a part of the story is that really what went wrong was that during World War II, people were desperately keen to ensure that the fighting force and that the people at home were properly fed, because they knew that millions of young men would be killed during the war, and they had to replace that stock, breeding stock, so to speak, with good, healthy, strong people, young people. And so there was a major operation during World War II run by the professor of biochemistry at the University of London, Jack Drummond, to ensure the link between food production, food distribution, nutrition, and health. Now, after the war, that was abandoned because people said, the industry at any rate said, what we need is production. That's where we need more and more and more and more. And that's when it started to go downhill. Then we had research institutes of looking into the production of protein and things like that in cereals, production of protein in animals. And there the major concern was protein was important for growth. Now, that then got translated from animals into humans. Now, protein is great for if you want to grow a pig or a cow or a horse or something like that, but it is not the thing that's important for humans. If you take human milk contains the least amount of protein of any large mammal, but the amount of the essential fats that is present in human milk, the energy the mother produces to put that in the milk for the baby, is greater than the energy she puts into all 10 essential amino acids for the protein. Now, I like to take my messages from physiology, and there's a very, very glaring message about the significance of essential fats to humans than over the lack of significance of protein. You get protein from almost any source. A rhinoceros reaches the age of 4, weighs a ton, and it got all that fantastic velocity of growth from the simplest food resource. And that's provided all the protein that's needed to power that phenomenal growth. But it doesn't have a brain. So there are lots of these very simple messages that people need to just think about and internalize and get round to the fact that there was this huge mistake about protein. Protein is not the thing that's important for Homo sapiens. Important for cows, pigs, and rhinoceroses, but not for humans. And that was a big mistake. And that's led to the focus on land-based food and agriculture at the cost of the seafood, which we've just used as a dumping ground for our shit and everything else.
You've talked about agriculturalizing the oceans and eventually the need to really treat the oceans in a more sustainable way for getting the foodstuffs that we apparently need from them. Tell us what you mean by that when you say agriculturalizing.
Well, yeah, there's a very interesting recent analysis by two Australians, Gary Bradshaw and Barry Brooks at the University of Adelaide in Australia, where they have looked at the whole population crisis that we've got at the moment. And they've come to the conclusion that the sustainability by the planet is only fit for about 2 billion people, and we've now got 7 billion, and there's likely to be 9 billion in a very short space of time. This is the most serious thing. And the Foresight analysis in 2011, which was an intergovernmental thing, an international analysis of food and agriculture for the future, they talked about the fact that there were some 400 people involved in producing the report, and they talked about the fact that there's not enough arable land to meet the requirements for this 7 billion that we've got at the moment. There's not enough new arable not enough new land that can be brought into arable production to meet the requirements for this number of people. And you can see it in all the statistics of death and mortality around the planet, and you can see it in the statistics of what we call the hidden hunger, namely the heart disease, dementia, and things like that we're in, and now the mental ill health that we're seeing in the West. We really are going downhill. So the answer is we cannot do it from land. So, 10,000 years ago, the guy said, we're running out of food. What are we going to do? Well, we've got to, agriculturalize the land. That's basically what they did. They domesticated the animals and they domesticated plants. Now, this is, the 21st century. Surely, for heaven's sakes, 71% of the planet is covered in water. Of what's left, only 33% of it is capable of providing food. So it makes a huge amount of sense to do what they did 10,000 years ago on land in the oceans. That's what I mean by agriculturalizing. Aquaculture is not going to do it because it means feeding fish with fish. And if the total fish catch plateaued about 10, 14 years ago, and we're not going to get any more fish. We are, in effect, behaving like Neanderthals so far as the oceans is concerned. We're just hunting and gathering. That's what people did 100,000 years ago, hunting and gathering. They just got better technology to do it. And what we've now got to do is to treat the oceans as the last resource for food. And the only way we can do that is to agriculturalize it. Now, we have grass for sheep and cows. You can have marine grass for fish. That's what the Japanese are doing. They've got a whole area of country, of seaside, so to speak, where they've been doing this. And they've tripled fish production just simply by doing things like that. Artificial reefs, so on and so forth. We've actually got to start using the ocean floor and the sunlight and the wealth of the ocean to develop a new food system based on the oceans. And if we do that, we will solve all the health problems that we have today as well.
That gets into some giant social questions just because when you think about it, the agriculturalization of the land went hand in hand probably with borders being drawn and people saying, I own this land, you own that land. And one of the things that's always been true of the ocean is that essentially once you get a few miles out from the coastline, it becomes international waters. And that sort of lack of direct ownership leads to it's every man for himself, every fisher for himself mentality of just grabbing all the fish you can without worrying about the sustainability of the aquatic environment.
Well, absolutely right. I mean, that's exactly what happened 10,000 years ago, and you're perfectly correct about that. And the people are just exploiting that massive area out at sea. Nobody's saying who belongs what. And as I said, it's a Neanderthal philosophy that they're using to use the oceans at the moment. They're just hunting and gathering, and we've got to use our intelligence that God gave us. And if we don't do that, we've had it. The other point I'd like to make is there's been an extraordinarily reluctance for people to actually internalize the significance of the human brain and the significance of the fact that it really does need proper food to build the thing in the first place and to keep it working. We published a paper in 1971, and my wife and I published a book called What We Eat Today. And in that book we said that, heart disease, you can see the evidence of nutritional distortion as a major player in human health with the rise in heart disease from the beginning of the last century to the 1970s when it was number one killer. Okay? Now that was perfectly understood at the time that this was bad news and it was mostly diet that was causing it. And at that time it was thought that bad fats were particularly responsible for it. Okay, there may be other things responsible for it as well, sugar and so on, and that was also being discussed. But the point was that at the end of the line, it was the wrong kind of nutrition that was responsible for it. And with the element of bad fats being a part of that, if the brain's made of fat, we argued in the book that the brain will be the next. And we put this prediction out in a book called What We Eat Today. And Graham Rose reviewed the book in the Sunday Times on the 5th of November in 1972. And in the review, he said that if these guys are right, we will become a race of morons unless we do something about it.
You can't get much more stark and dramatic than that.
Yeah. I mean, this is science. Science says, let's predict, and let's test whether that prediction is correct or false. We predicted in 1972 that unless you do something about serving the interests of the brain, with the things that it needs, then the brain is going to be the next thing in firing line after heart disease. Now this has happened.
That leads me to two questions. One, as far as the fundamental building blocks of the brain, even people that are eating a crappy Western, completely inland diet that does not have the seafood levels you're talking about, we're not talking about them having a peanut-sized brain. Something is still kind of making up the difference. What is it that's making up the difference in a person with a bad diet that's still kind of giving them the volume and the mass of the brain that they wind up with, even if it's not a perfectly functioning brain?
Well, the two answers in a sense to that. One is your brain, really 70% of your brain cells have divided before you were born. So really the early part of brain of the adult, the early years are determinants of the brain of the adult. And the brain itself has its own intelligence. It does not like to be fiddled about with by whatever the rest of the body is doing. And so effectively it recycles its own stuff. For example, it makes its own cholesterol. It doesn't care how much cholesterol you've got in your blood, low or high, it makes its own. And it's not interested in what's going round in circles round outside it. So the brain has a phenomenal ability to maintain itself. But like any other system, no recycling process is 100% efficient. So it's my view that to maintain the brain in health, you need to maintain the inflow of DHA, the important omega-3 fatty acid. You need to maintain that throughout life. If you think about the evolutionary period that gave birth to the brain, that powered the development of the brain to create Homo sapiens, every single meal would have been rich in this stuff. And it's not just DHA. I just want to add this. It's not just DHA. Think about iodine. It comes from the same source. There are 2 billion people at the moment, according to the World Health Organization, that are at risk to iodine deficiency. And they're almost certainly at risk to DHA deficiency as well. So I think as far as the adult is concerned, you do need to get to grips with the fact that your brain is recycling its stuff and it needs topping up all the time. And that's the only answer I can give.
Is there such a thing as too much of a good thing when it comes to seafood? Are there any upper limits to your thinking, or all the seafood you can get is probably going to be just fine?
Well, as far as I know, there's no upper limit. I think the Ausbach study showed that there was no upper limit at any rate. And the Japanese show as well that there can't really be much in the way of an upper limit. I don't think there's ever been anybody, even feeding fish oils at quite high levels, do not seem to have any kind of toxicity.
So for people that are not seafood fans for whatever reason or don't have adequate access, something like supplementing with omega-3 fatty acids is probably advisable, but not as optimal as actually getting food straight from the source that might have additional micronutrients. Is that a fair assessment? That's
I think, pretty accurate assessment. I think the whole package in the seafood is full of both all the essential fats that are needed, as well as all these other micronutrients that you mentioned. And I mentioned iodine in particular, but there's also selenium, zinc, copper, and manganese, which are important. But, if you want to take fish oil, you should be taking a sort of a mineral supplement with it.
I had a period of my life for almost 7 years where I was a strict vegan, which I find myself looking back on and cringing a little bit that I might have really been under-nutritionalizing myself with a lot of things. But on the other hand, there are a lot of studies that really show people maintaining strong cognition very late in life with a much more vegetarian diet. How is that working with people that are vegan or vegetarian?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that works because really it's your mother that did the trick, not you.
All right, well...
It's as simple as that. And your intelligence is dependent on what happened before you were born. And so it really is your mother that is the person who is responsible for your cognitive ability. I'm not happy with vegetarianism. There is one point that it needs to be made, that there is so much, I was going to use a rude word about it, but there's so much anti-types of food being consumed today in such vast quantities. I mean, there's absolutely nothing wrong with a beef burger or something like that, but in vast quantities, it then becomes, it kicks everything else out of the window. And so there's so much of that sort of stuff going into people's stomachs these days that if you're a vegetarian, you avoid it all. And so, this swings and roundabouts. So the vegetarian diet, your mother made your brain, so that's fine. But so you want to keep it, and you want to keep your heart healthy as well. And a vegetarian diet avoids an awful lot of that kind of stuff. But I don't think there's any evidence whatsoever that Homo sapiens was a vegetarian during evolution.
You're the founder of the Mother and Child Foundation. Can you tell us a little about that organization and what it does?
The work of the Mother and Child Foundation really was to gather money to support research work into maternal nutrition and health during pregnancy. One of the things that they did as a consequence of this early work was a randomized clinical trial in the East End of London, which showed that micronutrient supplementation from the earliest possible time in pregnancy did actually have a significant benefit in a high-risk population such as we have there, that we had a better than twofold reduction in the proportion, rather, of babies that were born small for gestational age. So that's the sort of thing that the foundation has been doing. It's also been developing nutrition-based food analysis to enable it to provide proper advice to people if they want it about how to eat properly and so on and so forth. But the main focus has been on funding work that's going to tell us what is needed during pregnancy or before pregnancy to ensure the optimum outcome for health and intelligence of the next generation. And at the moment we're funding work at Imperial College in London where we're using magnetic resonance imaging to look at the brain at birth to identify the relationship between different regions of the brain, which funnily enough require different things, to relate that to maternal nutrition around about the time of the beginning of pregnancy and through the pregnancy, to further test this whole idea that it is important at the beginning of pregnancy rather than at the end that matters.
Fantastic. That sounds like really great work, and it's great to see an intersection point between charity and really science-backed evidence as to what's going to be effective in the real world.
Well, you see, if you take the brain, for example, whilst all the signaling systems of the brain are rich in docosahexaenoic acid, the glial cells are rich in arachidonic acid. It's quite different. So both of these things are important for the brain is concerned. But most people in the literature at the moment are only talking about omega-3, but there is an essential requirement for some omega-6 as well. And so different, really, amygdala, one part of the brain which is concerned with behavior, is also rich in arachidonic acid. Different regions of the brain do different things, and so that is reflected in the different fats of the brain, because it's the fats that are doing all this work of signaling and all the stuff that the brain does, the myelination and everything else. 60% of the brain is fat. And, this is our priority. That is the priority so far as the nutrition of the mother and indeed the nutrition of ourselves at great ages.
Is the lack of focus on the omega-6s simply because that's something which is so readily present in most of our diets anyway that it doesn't need to be worried that we're not getting enough?
That is correct. In fact, it goes a bit further than that, because there are some people saying we've got far too much omega-6, and there could be an element of truth in that, because all these families, these essential fatty acid families, and indeed the non-essential fatty acids, are all using the same enzyme systems. And it's like all, we understood this in proteins, that, if you gave one amino acid in great excess, it stopped the utilization of some of the others. And if you give one essential fat in great excess, it's going to interfere with the use of the other ones. So there is an element of truth in that. But I think what this is focusing on is linoleic acid, the stuff that comes from the plants, the seed oil, from the soya beans, and so on and so forth. And I think that is the one that is causing the most trouble.
Okay, well, any final thoughts that you'd like to highlight? I really appreciate all the time, and I think there's just been a wealth of good information for people.
I think the only thing I can say is, in finishing, is that the brain evolved in the sea. Life began in the ocean. We really depend on the oceans. We have to save the oceans to save ourselves. And the thing that deeply concerns me is not just the simple answer to the future of humanity, namely the agriculturalization of the oceans. But to do that, we're going to have to address a huge problem, and that is pollution of the estuaries and the coastlines, because that is where the marine food chain takes off in earnest. And we've just been totally reckless about this. We've been shitting and throwing our industrial waste into the rivers, and that has killed the estuaries. In Britain, we've got a huge number of our supposed to be prime beaches unfit for swimming in. It's crazy, but it's across the planet. You take any estuary you like, and you'll see, unless you go to Alaska and some very faraway places, that they've been polluted to hell and back. They were once extremely rich sources of food and nourishment. Even in 1900, the barman in the East End of London would go down to the River Thames and fill their buckets with oysters and put them on the bar for free. You can't do that anymore. And we've got to get to grips with the fact that the brain is going downhill. And the only way we're going to fix that is, again, with the oceans. Life began in the oceans. The brain evolved in the oceans. And we have to save the oceans to save ourselves.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So huge thanks to Dr. Crawford for sharing his time with us. I'm sure that probably 2/3 of the audience, including myself, is going to be going to the refrigerator right now and looking to see if we've actually got any fish. And if there's nothing in the refrigerator, looking for some canned tuna up in one of the cupboards. But some really persuasive ideas there, and an exciting idea, the agriculturalizing the ocean, something that I hadn't, I guess, ever really given that much thought to. But maybe there's a large social movement that should exist there that doesn't, that it's good to start seeding the idea about. But now, as promised, the ruthless listener retention and gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts. Ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Okay, so I came across an article from November of 2013. This was published in Psychological Science magazine with the intriguing title, The Ergonomics of Dishonesty. And you think about those two things, ergonomics and honesty or dishonesty, and what the heck do these have to do with one another? The ergonomics is like how something fits posturally, how it, a physical object interacts with a person. Is your glove ergonomically comfortable? Is the chair that you're sitting in comfy on your butt and makes your back posture correct? Things like that. So what's this have to do with dishonesty? Well, there was this TED Talk, maybe about a year and a half ago is when I saw it. It was pretty popular. We'll put a link up to it. It was talking about these power poses, how you can affect how you feel, your mood, your confidence, all these things by essentially standing in kind of like a Wonder Woman or a Captain America sort of pose. Puff up your chest and put your hands on your hips and stand with your legs akimbo. It's going to make you feel better about the world, more powerful, your position compared to other people. And the opposite's also true. If you curl up in a fetal position like you're afraid of getting kicked or something like that, hunch over like a whipped dog, you're gonna feel like a whipped dog, and you're gonna have more of a doom and gloom outlook and things like that. They've shown this in numerous studies, and this sort of study, this ergonomics of dishonesty, this article actually is looking at 4 different studies. So it's sort of a mashup of several different studies, all looking at, well, what about when you're not intentionally getting into a power pose, or you're not intentionally curling up in a fetus position, but the physical objects that you're interacting with in the real world just kind of happen to put you in that position. An example would be the desk that you're sitting in while you're taking a test, or the rental car that you've rented and are driving around a new city. Is it one that's a little bit too small for you and you're kind of cramped up in the opposite of a power position, or is it one with a wide steering wheel and plenty of leg room and you're kind of in a naturally expansive position as you drive? And does this have an effect on our psychology? And according to these studies, the answer is definitively yes, that there were statistically significant changes in how people behaved just based on the ergonomics of the physical spaces that they kind of happened to be in by pure happenstance, not through any selection process of their own. So it wasn't like people who feel worthless are picking cramped little cars and getting into them, and that's the explanation for these findings. What they found, among other things, was that individuals who engaged in expansive postures were more likely to steal money, cheat on tests, and commit traffic violations in a driving simulator. Not necessarily good things. It's really kind of one of those studies that leaves you scratching your head, because on the one hand, you watch the original TED Talk and you're like, cool, power positions, expansive poses. I'm going to stand in this Captain America pose for 5 minutes every day and feel great about myself. And then this study is kind of saying, well, you might feel great about yourself, but you'll feel so great about yourself that you're going to take advantage of the fellow people in the world around you and be more likely to engage in antisocial behavior. So yeah, there's an interesting discussion when the authors at the end of this article get into what these findings actually mean. And I think that almost anybody would agree that these studies are interesting enough that they require that we do some more studies before making any sort of prescriptive decisions about chairs and widths of steering wheels and things like that. But how mind-bending to think that these seemingly innocuous interactions that we have with physical objects every day could be having a subtle but profound effect on the way that we interact as humans.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart, we have smart in our title twice.
And that is the entire episode, number 51. If you liked what you heard, please recommend this podcast to your friends and or leave us a review on iTunes. As usual, the show notes for this episode will be online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com, including the links to all the stuff we talked about here. I will be back at you next week. It is going to be my birthday week, and because I'm not an alcohol drinker, I get to decide if I'm going to be celebrating with a aniracetam or a armodafinil or what my nootropic of choice on my birthday is. Further deliberations forthcoming, but in the meantime, have a great week and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.